Welcome to The Detail. I'm your host, Kathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida. With me today, is Andrew Georgiadis. Andrew Georgiadis is an accomplished urban planner. He has worked with the leaders of new urbanism and really is a leader in new urbanism himself. Andrew Georgiadis was part of the Urban Design Studio in Sarasota, and he heads up his own planning firm now. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be talking about the Pencil Tower.
Thank you so much for this invitation.
Absolutely. Can you just share before we get into this, Andrew? Sometimes I love the phrase, you can't be a prophet in your own hometown. I think we got an amazing resource of knowledge and expertise. Where around the world have you worked on planning projects? Because you've done quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been able to plan in the Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and a little bit in North Africa with an Egypt project, and then in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and recently a lot of projects in Brazil. So and also in Europe and Russia. So scattered around, the country and and
And it's
elsewhere.
quite a portfolio that you have. You worked with Andres Duani.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of working with him on a few charrettes, never as his employee, but
Mm-hmm.
he and his wife Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk were mentors of mine and professors of mine as well, back in university days. So
Okay. And I
we've
also want
kept
to
up a
say you
friendship.
worked with Victor Dover,
Yes,
his
yes.
partner. You have to tell me, I forget
Yeah,
his name.
Joe Cole and Victor Dover, with whom I'll be seeing them tomorrow in Lake Wales. They're unveiling the comprehensive plan for that city, so I'm going
I
to go
saw him
support.
post on that
Yes,
on I think it was Instagram. So Lake Wales is going through a whole visioning project,
yes,
and you're working on that.
yes.
So
Well, I'm not working on it. I'm just going to attend and support, and I wanted actually just to see what the latest and best thinking is on comprehensive planning for small towns. So
yeah. So we really in Florida have a wealth of knowledge and expertise, leaders in planning. I remember my first exposure. Andres Duani wrote the master plan in the early 2000s for downtown Sarasota. My
yes,
first exposure to Andres Duani, I believe it was like in the 80s when I was reading about the Panhandle. Now the name
yes.
escapes me.
Seaside. Yeah, yes,
Yeah, Seaside and his planning of Seaside, which he basically patterned after Charleston, South Carolina, and the planning codes had gotten so removed from
yes,
kind of the bones of the American Main Street and city
yes,
pre-World War II, the walkable, friendly, setting the table for um, a great retail experience, a great community experience. And I remember I was living in New York City, which of course is highly walkable and where I was born, and then went back and lived there for a few years. And I thought, why aren't we doing more of this in
yes,
the country? Because there was a way that I longed to see that. I've traveled quite a bit, and we've been designing sprawl in the United
yes,
States, auto-centric development. So
yes,
so anyway, I just want people to know what a
yes.
great background you have.
Well,
And,
thank you.
yeah. So regarding Obsidian, the proposal for a building on Palm Avenue, which, reminds me of Pencil Towers in New York City
Yes,
and San Francisco, you gave me a call because my conversation with Ron Shapiro, there were things, and he's leading the opposition. He lives in Bay Plaza. There were things there that concerned you, and I always want to get it right. And I want to give you the opportunity to correct some definitions that we got wrong.
sure.
But before we do that, let me share some photos for people who may be new to this or need a refresher regarding what we're talking about. This is a photograph on Palm Avenue of these little shops in front of Bay Plaza. and you can see a gentleman walking here. And what's being proposed, I'm going to go to a different picture, which may give you everybody an even better view of what is being proposed. Bay Plaza is 165 feet tall. And on the other side is Gulfstream Avenue. And then you've got our marina, the bayfront, and a fabulous water view. The building to the left of Bay Plaza is called the Jewel. That building is 225 feet. The tallest buildings right now in Sarasota are about 252 feet, and the code specifies a limit at 18 stories, which by most height definitions works out to be 252 feet. What's being proposed on a lot size that is about a quarter acre, which comprises those little shops behind the cabbage palms and the shade of the cabbage palms, is a building that would be, if it's permitted to move forward, 342 feet. So it's about more than twice the size of Bay Plaza. It will tower over the Jewel. And, it's pretty clear that the motivation for going up so high is to provide water views for the higher floors in the proposed building, which is going by the name Obsidian. Its name may change later, who knows? How do you get to 18 stories being 342 feet instead of 252 feet? Well, there's what many would call a loophole in the code, where the interstitial space, which means the space between floors, is unspecified, in terms of a height limit. And so that amount of space is typically maybe 2 to 4 feet, and it's being designed at 7 feet, which as a practical matter looks to most people that this is just a way to get a really tall building. So, Andrew, I've set it up in terms of where we are and why people are upset. They feel, like I said, pencil towers in New York and San Francisco seem aesthetically not pleasing. The footprint is about a quarter acre. We'll get into other issues besides height. But you started off calling me and saying, hey, you're really not getting the definition of interstitial space right. So let's talk there. What is this? We'll start there. Tell me about the space between the floors, interstitial space, and why you feel it's important for people to understand better.
Any multi-story building on Earth has interstitial space, whether it be residential or office or.
That's where like air conditioning ducts go, and what goes in there?
So it's several things, structural and mechanical, and generally in buildings of this size, you'll see a slab, and then occasionally there'll be a girder, or in some cases beams, transfer beams, moment beams, all these other things, but those require thickness. So then below that, often we need space for the HVAC distribution, ductwork, plumbing. Below that, we have the ceiling itself, which can have its own mini substructure. It can be mini trusses even to span if needed. It can be, all sorts of things, and this is, of course, in loft style development, you eliminate that because you often just see the ductwork, so, but in typical conventional ceilinged spaces, you do have that structure. And each of those 3 layers often requires a little bit of space between its neighbor. That's what interstitial space does, and it's present in almost every development, that is, and it's very thick. It's surprisingly thick in many cases. I'm not saying it's as thick as this one,
right?
Necessity, but it's surprisingly thick.
When you were listening to the show and watching the discussion with Ron Shapiro, who lives in Bay Plaza, who's part of a group of residents that are very concerned, but there are a lot of people who just live in the city, who live in the county, who look at this height, and there's a feeling of, there goes Sarasota, there goes the neighborhood, this is too much.
Yes.
we have a certain charm and a certain scale that we want to maintain, and this is really gaming the system. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
feeling, that this is
Yes.
too tall for that space. Are you sympathetic at all to that, or do you think that it's really not a big deal? I mean, how do you want to?
Uh,
Yeah.
So, so I understand the angst that arises with ruptures in scale, in existing scale, especially with new development, and I'm not at all callous to that. However, as somebody who's also on the code writing side for municipalities,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most important lessons I've learned over the last 2 decades of doing form-based codes and other zoning amendments and the code, there's a lot of responsibility for a code to be tightly written if we want certain outcomes. I am leery about blaming the architect for using the code to extract the maximum value, even if it's perceived. The architect and the developer's job is to extract the most value
Mm-hmm.
using the constraints, using the regulatory constraints that are present. So whenever I see something that may cause somebody angst, I think, well, rather than sort of clobber them over the head, the
Mm-hmm.
design and the development team, I
Mm-hmm.
like to look at the code and say, well, okay, what does this code then encapsulate the community's desires, and how did this code get to the state that it is? And to me, that's a more interesting question because there are many other sites that have 18-story zoning DTB, in our city. So this is just one building, and if this is an issue, we ought to be focusing once again, I think on our code.
On the code.
Right. Right.
So explain now. I described this height limit of 18 stories as being limited to downtown core. That's not actually correct. So what's the difference
Okay.
between downtown Bayfront and downtown core, and what's the height difference?
So most of the center city is regulated by three different zoning districts, which are DTB, DTC, and DTE.
Mm-hmm.
And so DTB roughly has an 18-story height limit. DTC has mostly a 10-story height limit, but it has exceptions for 11 stories if public parking is provided, or 15 in the case of up to two sites within the city. And then DTE is at 5 stories. There's basically a range of heights, 18, 11, 10, and 5
Mm-hmm.
that are at play in the center of the city.
I mean, I think I know why, but I want you to explain. Why would downtown Bayfront be the highest?
So downtown Bayfront was the highest because the idea was that front row, which has the possibility of views, and I mean the whole block depth, which is why it's from Gulfstream all the way to Palm. It's generally one block deep.
So you mentioned downtown edge zoning is 5 stories. And back when
Yes.
you were in the urban design studio, one of the conversations I remember, the thing you pointed out to me, because you and I share a love of travel. Florence is one of my favorite cities. Paris and Florence, Paris is a great city too. Paris and Florence are maybe the most valuable, as you pointed out, built
Yes.
environments on the planet. People love to be in
Yes.
those spaces. And I think this is where people in Sarasota, they're not necessarily professionals like you are, but they have a feeling about what feels good to them. And
Yes.
it's Paris and Florence are, they're not full of 10 and 18-story buildings. Most
Yes.
of their buildings are five
Yes.
stories.
Yes.
So,
The,
and
the,
there's
tour, the Tour Montparnasse still generates controversy, which is being the only skyscraper in central Paris, so
yeah.
yeah.
So tell me, why is that height so conducive to, a beautiful built environment, a livable built environment? And can you appreciate that, maybe people in Sarasota don't have the language, the professional language, but they do have what they're feeling and what they're saying is grounded in
Yes.
truth about what
Yes.
feels right. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think the instinct is correct. I think what you're describing when we talk about most of the glorious traditional settlements, wherever they may occur, whether it's Asia or Europe
Mhm.
and these places of exceeding charm, is we're, 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 we're looking at a walk-up scale. So it's basically a pre-elevator scale,
Mhm.
and it is it's basically the upper limits of what one is willing to climb in terms of staircases, and
Mhm.
that limits the height of many of those buildings. So in Paris, you sometimes get a little bit high with you put extra floors into the mansards, for instance, and you can get maybe an eighth story or so. But really, it's on the whole walk-up scale. In other words, if electricity
Five
ended
stories.
tomorrow and the elevators were not working,
Mhm.
one could still inhabit those buildings.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
limits of the human being, except for triathletes, is really about that because
Mhm.
it's very burdensome to
All
occupy
groceries.
buildings. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Now, one of the interesting things, though, about those environments also is that it's not only that there are fewer floors, but the ceilings tend to be much higher floor to ceiling than American
Really.
ceilings, sometimes double or even triple. So, for instance, I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago and looking at a four-story building that was 100 feet tall, from the 1600s.
Yeah.
And it has a piano nobile, which is a floor to ceiling height of 30 feet, very grand. It has a ground
Wow.
floor of 18 feet, it has another floor of 14, etc. So it was an extraordinarily tall building that was very few stories.
Now,
And
why
that's
was that done?
yes. So there's many different reasons, and it would probably be a whole nother day to talk about this. But
Mhm.
generally, whenever we look at the deep sustainability and we look into our past and we see construction methods in the many millennia before heating and mechanized heating and cooling,
Mhm.
AC systems and such, it's a matter of survival to have, for instance, higher ceilings, especially in hotter
Mm.
climates.
Yeah.
Yes. And so buildings often had, when you look at Spain and Italy and Greece and all of these places that were growing for 5,000 years, and they managed to achieve comfort because they had courtyards, they had high ceilings, they had cross
So they would
ventilation.
rise to
Yes,
the
yes.
ceiling
Basically,
height.
because if you guarantee that the warm layer of hot rising air is well above the eye level of the tallest building occupant,
Mhm.
you can almost bear 100-degree summer day even in Rome. And when you combine that, for instance, with marble floors and the material choice, which have a good thermal properties and cooling effect, and the cross ventilation in the courtyards, and you put all of
Mhm.
these things together, you get an immensely livable environment that is not so dependent upon high energy inputs. And so
Mhm.
this was one of the things that we as humans did by necessity because we were responding to our energy constraints at the time and our other needs. But even in our modern day, we can look back at those qualities and say, perhaps some of those are worth emulating, in order to inform our new architecture.
Yeah. So you do understand why people in Sarasota seeing these super tall buildings
Yes,
would be sad that that there's a certain scale and charm that's being lost, and there actually is a really good are really good examples on the planet all over the place of how that 5 story
yes.
limit makes sense.
I don't know if this is the right time to talk about it, but when we look at a municipal zoning code, especially one that has already been rewritten and in which property rights have been altered over time,
Mhm.
it's very different than when you're coding a greenfield project from scratch, in which you don't have to consider previous constraints upon development
Yeah,
in
I mean,
terms of your new
there's
code.
there's something in Florida called the Bird Harris
The
Act.
Byrd-Harris Act, yes.
And that's pretty huge. And what the Bird Harris Act basically says is if I own property and I have the right to build something there, that the government may not interfere with that, may not take that right away. How have you seen
Yeah.
that play out?
Whenever I've been involved in a form-based code or rewriting a zoning code, I've always the teams with whom I've worked, we've always encountered the threat of Bert Harris. I haven't
Mhm.
actually had the pleasure of being in a Bert Harris lawsuit ever, but
We don't want that.
I've definitely encountered, a very upset land use attorneys, who invoke it in
Hmm.
when they're telling us that we can't do a certain zoning amendment. And as a zoning writer, as a code writer, it's one of those things where it's really a tight line because on one hand, one is trying to codify the desires of the community, their vision for themselves and their future growth.
Hmm.
At the same time, one is also acutely aware of the of Paris and all of these other legal constraints, which make it difficult for us to make something stricter when it's taking away property rights or development rights.
So let me
So
ask you this.
there's a tension there
Yeah, there's
for
definitely a
code writers.
tension there. And even within the rights that, I live in a condominium building that, and the area where I live is zoned for 25 units an acre. But,
Yes,
we've only got 6 units. And the reason we have 6 units is because we all need to park. And so,
yes,
there are very legitimate restrictions on the maximums, that one may be in have to build, because there are other factors that must be met as well. And it's not a taking, right? It's just
yes,
there's many variables
yes,
that someone has to consider. Bert Harris, the existing property owners, so people in Bayfront Plaza, right? Yeah, Bay
yes,
Plaza, excuse me, 165 feet tall. And they had, when they bought, a certain expectation of enforcement of certain codes. Let's say the retail aspect. This new building
yes,
that's being proposed, there's a requirement in this area of downtown to have 100% of your frontage be
yeah,
retail. There's currently 7 small businesses right there. It's so important that we, in our built environment, set the table for small business to exist and to thrive. This proposal would take it from 7 storefronts down to 1. And instead of being 100% retail, it would be 30% retail,
mm,
which is against the code. Now, if I'm living in Bay Plaza, one of the things I would feel would be a taking, right? Just purely looking for my own self-interest and my property value is, I bought with a certain expectation, and the rules are what they are, and allowing exceptions to facilitate something this tall, which I think most people would read the code to
yeah,
say 342 feet is quite a stretch.
yes,
But to eliminate the retail also impacts the value of my property and what I
yeah,
expected in having a walkable community and a certain, even that walkability score, right? That's used. And I don't hear the Burt Harris Act being looked at that way. It's always about the new development getting what
yeah.
they're entitled to. But what about the existing?
I don't, forgive me, and I'm, once again,
Yeah.
I'm not a land use attorney, but I don't think it actually protects. I don't think it protects adjacent properties in terms of in the way that you described. I think
Okay.
it's strictly about the uh, not depriving the development applicant of property rights, which is,
Okay.
so I don't know if there's another legal mechanism, but I don't think Harris
See,
is
I
actually.
wonder, I wonder if it just
Yeah.
hasn't been interpreted that way. Because let's
Mm,
face it, the people who are going to litigate and they're going to see it are the builders, are the developers. The existing residents often don't. And I'm just curious how
yeah.
it could only work one way. It's if everybody has property rights. That's just a question. I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe a lawyer friend will call me and say,
It's
"Hey, I need to be on your show."
yeah.
But
The way I've understood it is that it's really and it's really a matter for when one is amending the regulatory the regulations. So whether it be zoning or
Mhm.
another regulation, is that one has to be always aware of altering a metric or a regulation, and that will it result in less sellable, you know,
Mhm.
space
Okay.
for.
Here in Florida, do you know when that Burt Harris Act actually came about? That wasn't that long ago, was it?
I don't know when it was
Okay.
signed into law. I can look it
No,
up, but
that's okay. I don't
okay.
want to everybody. Well, we're going to pull us out of the weeds. You're listening to the detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, and my guest is Andrew Georgiadis. We are talking about the proposed project on the bayfront of Sarasota, but on Palm Avenue, which is like one street behind. It's proposed to be 342 feet tall, which is more than double its immediate neighbor, and it is about 90 feet taller than the biggest building in Sarasota. So it's generated a lot of controversy. What is the future of Sarasota? What do we want our city to look like? And Andrew Georgiadis is an urban planner, and we're discussing this issue. You're worried about someone else's drinking and you don't know where to turn. Al-Anon family groups can help. Al-Anon and Alateen offer a mutual support program for families and friends of alcoholics. To find a meeting, call 1-888-425-2666 or visit al-anon.org. So getting back to my discussion with Andrew Georgiadis, there's a lot more to any building proposal than height. And so I want to talk about all these other issues,
Yes,
particularly retail. But you had sent me this drawing
yes.
regarding height
Hmm.
and and design of neighborhoods.
Yes,
So can you share why is
yes.
this important?
That diagram was Leon Creer's illustration of the principle we're talking about earlier, is that places that have a sense of a regulation of number of floors, but not necessarily feet, tend to have more interesting skylines and more comfortable interiors usually.
Okay.
So when you have a zoning code that is a strict number of feet, what happens is that a developer, and consequently the architect, will create as many floors as is possible within that number of feet. So if you have 100, let's say 100 feet, and you have the interstitial space, which is the necessary, structure and such, it's possible that ceilings can get very, very low, very stingy, and sometimes oppressively low, because it's the impulse to squeeze in the maximum number of floors within that envelope.
Yeah.
Regulating in floors, one can avoid that. Also, then create a more interesting skyline. Even though skyline is really an aesthetic concern, it's not a matter of life safety, health, or anything like that. But for those who are interested in skyline, you can achieve it better when you're not regulating by feet, but rather by floors.
Okay.
And then, so Leon Creer was very influential to many of the new urbanists, including DPZ and Dover Cole and many of the others, who, when they started to create municipal codes, began to bend that habit of American cities regulating by feet
Okay.
in order to push us in this direction.
Hmm.
Now, one of the interesting things, though, and how it relates to interstitial space, is that when those early form-based codes were being done, and Sarasota is one of the earliest municipal form-based codes, in the center of the city. It was done
In
in.
the US?
Yes, yes. It was actually after Seaside and after a lot of the T&Ds, traditional neighborhood developments done by that first generation of new urbanists.
Hmm.
There was a gap in time in which coding actually, those ideas made their way up into municipal planning departments.
Okay.
So before that, there had been no codes that embodied any of these concepts of walkability and mixed use and all the things that is considered mainstream, was
Hmm.
completely thwarted by zoning codes of that era. And so Sarasota was one of the testing grounds for bringing some of those some of that philosophy into municipal coding, which had really never occurred before.
So
So
we're kind of pioneers. Like sometimes people say, oh, there's all this,
yes,
fighting about what's
yes,
going on. But if you look at the fact that Sarasota really has been on the forefront of some of this planning, it kind of makes sense that there's going to
yes,
be, some friction around new ideas.
yes. And that original Dwani code, just once again, this in my statement, I'm not advocating for a certain number of stories or less or fewer by saying what I'm about to say, but I just wanted to say as a fact of history
Okay.
that that when Dwani and Elizabeth Pletter Zyberg and team authored this code, in many sense did reduce the development rights and heights from the previous code. So
Okay.
what we're seeing right now, even with exotic interpretations, is actually reduction, or it's a more petite city than what was implied by the former code that it replaced.
Say that again. It's a more what city?
It's a more petite. It's a more
Okay.
it's a shorter city in many
Mhm.
places, from that old code. So
Yeah.
when people blame Dwani for all all the sins and say,
Mm.
look how things are getting real tall, he actually and his wife and his team
Mhm.
accomplished almost the unheard of task of reducing the scale of what was allowed through the 90s.
Okay.
And so we actually would need to thank them for having made the city more human scale than it may have been. It may have turned out had they not coded it this
Oh,
way.
that's important information. I think most
Yeah.
people aren't aware of that. There's a phrase, and I want to get your take on this. So I saw a meme once that a friend of mine shared with me, whose brother was a planner. He actually serves on the hospital board, Victor Rowe, and his brother teaches planning um, in a different state. And it was like desert, and there was a skyscraper. And it
Yes.
basically, the thing was what a developer would build if you let them. In other words, they always want to go as high as they possibly can go, right, and get as much
Yeah.
out of
It's
one
their
space.
job. It's the reason for getting out of bed in the morning.
Well, yeah, but there's also a way, in the stock market, there's a phrase: bulls make money and bears make money, but pigs get slaughtered. That
Yes.
And I think this is true in real estate, that you can build to a point where you're concentrating so much resource value in one spot that's out of context with the rest of the community, that you're actually hobbling the community, that keeping things to a certain scale and amount ensures that your building will sell out. It ensures that there's going to be demand next door. By spreading out residents, you're providing customers for businesses that are close by. You know
Yes.
that that putting all of your eggs in one basket is not a good idea in a stock portfolio, and it's not a good idea in real estate for a community, right? To be granting huge exceptions in one area that truly can't be sustained throughout.
Yeah.
So that there are times where a developer is better off with a shorter building that's going to sell like that. My mom was in real estate, and she would tell it's I think this analogy fits it. She would tell her listing owners, sometimes the first offer you get is your best offer, and that time
Yes.
is money. And sometimes, you take the money, it may not be perfect, you get out and you put it in the next place. But to wait and to wait and to wait is, for this maximum, may not be so smart. Likewise, to demand the absolute maximum without considering the whole may not be
Yeah.
so smart, and may actually, bite you in the
Yeah.
end, financially, not just. So do you think there's any truth to that, okay, you're going to ask for the most, however, sometimes it's wiser for a developer to work within some constraints within the community, and and not get everything they asked for?
Well, yes. Overall, yes. The constraints aren't a bad thing. Constraints, um, of course, even when on the design side, I appreciate well written and tightly written constraints in order to say, your assignment is to create poetry out of this envelope, out of this set of constraints, and it's harder to design, I find, when there are none at all.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use the word exceptions to describe, well, maybe with
Okay.
the retail frontage, yes, but
Okay.
going back to the code, when it comes down to it, the mechanism by which the height is being achieved is the interstitial definition. In interstitial
Yeah.
space, the dimension is not regulated by our code.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the reason why that dimension is not regulated is because in the 90s, and the aughts, even when there was still boarded up storefronts in Sarasota, and one couldn't imagine urban vibrancy here. When
Mm-hmm.
it was in a different state. It was unthinkable for many cities, including Sarasota, to need to regulate that because no developer would do more than what is necessary to provide the structure and the ductwork and ceiling and all those things that I had described earlier.
It just wasn't conceivable that they would
Right.
max out.
Yes. And so one of the principles we do as code writers, and this is very hard for me sometimes, is that if it's unlikely, if it's not absolutely necessary, we delete it.
Okay.
And so that's one of those things where the discussion about interstitial space has it's one of those things where, because one could not fathom that it would be interpreted that way,
Mm-hmm.
it was not regulated.
That reminds me, I mean, this is just from a security standpoint. You look at the United States, and often with things like airline safety, no one could conceive that the cockpit would be breached by people meaning harm,
Right.
and so they didn't harden the cockpit. It just wasn't on the radar. And then when something awful happens, you harden the cockpit, right?
Yes. Yes.
Andrew, let's look at this question about retail space. It's being proposed to go from 100% retail frontage, which is actually what's required in the code for this area of downtown. If this proposal is approved, it would go from 100% retail frontage to 30%, a loss of 70%. With walkability, there are at least 4 requirements that I know of: that the walk be useful, that you be able to, meet your needs, go to the grocery store, go to the post office to mail a letter by walking, go buy a pair of socks, go pick up, a gallon of milk or a pizza, things like that, that there's a retail environment, go get your hair cut, that you don't have to get in a car, which is sustainable, reduces greenhouse gases. It's why people live in cities, one of the reasons. So a useful walk, an interesting walk, that it's not a bunch of blank walls. If you have these little retail establishments, there's a lot of fun in that, in walking around. Whereas if it's all blank space, like a building, the View in Sarasota, no retail frontage whatsoever, it's a bit of a loss, right? People are not going out of their way to walk by the View because there's really nothing there. And that it be a safe walk, you're not afraid of getting mugged, and that it be comfortable, which in Florida usually means shade, that you're not out in the blazing sun. So here is the retail frontage that currently exists and would be reduced from 7 shops to just 1, 7 little shops to 1 larger shop, 100% retail frontage to 30%. Isn't this, if it were granted, kind of a shame in terms of not sticking with the discipline of the code and of the rules which ensure walkability in Sarasota?
Yes, the reduction of the retail frontage. One of the frustrations we've seen with other cities is that the desire for vibrant storefronts,
Hmm.
the amount that can actually be leased and filled up and kept vibrant, there's often a mismatch between those two square footages.
Mm.
And once again, I haven't done any economic study, and so I can't comment that this is the case here. But we have noticed in many cities across the country that there is a reduction in, when they do code it, in the mandatory retail frontage diagram. That's been one of those things where it's contradictory to the principles of walkability, but economically we haven't always found a way to to address both the need of the walkable, continuous retail environment and mixed use, and also deliver vibrant storefronts in a market which some may say is oversaturated. And once again, I'm not saying that this particular site is, but I'm saying that it does follow a trend that we've seen in order to be very judicious and careful about how much brick and mortar retail, even in some center city locations, we ask for.
Hmm.
So this in fact follows that economic trend that we're seeing in
Well,
terms of.
it's interesting though, Andrew, in this storefront, and let me see if I can share this screen again, what you're seeing, because yeah, brick and mortar, there's a revolution going on with Amazon and all. But a lot of these are services. So, you can't send away to Amazon for your skincare or your haircuts. I think there's a beauty salon, there's a hair salon, there's a coffee shop. You can see, I guess, the smoke shop there, that may not be the bill, but there is a real demand for services, and a lot of these shops are services. So, for whatever that's worth in
Yes.
the discussion. And obviously these little shops are making it. This is where near Coconut and Palm, this is the area we're talking about.
So yes, this is the required retail frontage, and you'll notice though that retail is not limited only to these frontages in the city. There are many other places which have retail. So in our code, there are certain block frontages which are required to have retail as their ground floor use. And so this map, what you see in the red stripes, are the frontages or the block faces that that have to be retail.
Mm-hmm.
And then the dotted blue line, to the right are optional, but really most of the rest of this is also optional because retail is allowed as a use, by right in most of the blocks that we're looking at. This map, basically will govern, the redevelopment of all the properties in downtown over time as they get built up to new code. And that's also worth mentioning is that whether we treasure the buildings or not that we see right now in downtown that are short, like 1, 2, 3 stories, nearly all of them can be doomed over time because the height limit is so much greater than the existing buildings.
Because the
So,
lowest height limit is 5 stories.
well, then that's the edge. But I'm talking about where DTC is. Like, let's say that there's 1-story streets along Main Street in downtown Sarasota.
That's
That
downtown 4.
Right, so that can be 11 stories if public parking is provided, but 10 easily. So, and I'm saying this once again, not because I disparage any historic or older or shorter buildings, but I'm saying as a matter of fact, those buildings are all doomed because the economics of it, combined with the current zoning code, makes it, those are all placeholder buildings. So, to realistically talk about the future, we have to realize that nearly the entire center city that isn't already built out at the current zoning's max
Mm-hmm.
will they be built out and will be demolished and be rebuilt at that higher level.
Except, I gave the example earlier about how other restrictions can alter a building, what a building turns out to be. You can be zoned for 25 residential units, but only, parking restrictions you're really only building 6 stories and not,
Yes.
10. And let's face it, the economics are constrained too. This isn't going to, I would say, even in the next 50 years, you're not going to see all these buildings suddenly becoming knocked down and have 10-story buildings.
Right.
This happens over time,
It does.
and a long
Yes.
time, right?
But I'm saying that there is significant frustration in our future, though.
Okay. Okay.
That's what I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
alert everyone, because oftentimes it's imagined by residents and by the public that what we see there in our built reality is the considered in real estate terms the highest and best use, as per code.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge gap between what we're, our built fabric, our built environment, and what is applied by our code. That's all I was trying to
I
point out.
gotcha. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but yes,
So,
you're right, because even in very valuable, urban environments like Manhattan, as you had said, in Boston and other places, even where buildings are sometimes not protected by historic preservation, we see a shorter building that has survived,
mm-hmm.
and the economic forces are such that it generates money in its 1850s shell
Mm-hmm.
without its parking, and it's just doing fine for its
Well,
owners. Right.
there's an inherent value, a lot of, the upfront cost of new construction and how that, once that's truly paid for, the cost of changing it, it's like driving a car until it dies versus trading in every 3 years, right? It made
Yeah.
a lot of economic sense. And then beauty has a value too.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just have a few more questions, Andrew. What do you say? Because as somebody who lives in a condo, I'm blessed to be able, live near the water. We're on the water. I would have a hard time spending the amount of money that, this penthouse for the Obsidian is projected. And you don't know that it will wind up being this, but $15 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is what they're talking about. An 18th floor at 342 feet. But there's a whole host of lower floors that are going to be, in addition to the water, before they look at the water, they're going to be looking at the top of a roof. That's pretty substantial. It's a pretty wide, Bay Plaza has a pretty big roof. And to me, it's very different to be right in front of the water versus, behind and looking at a roof being a significant part of your view. And my concern, if it were me, and even as someone in the community watching, does this really make the most economic sense? Are people going to be shelling out $5 million? Like if the top unit is 15 million, I'd say the middle maybe 5, right? Or even 2. And they're going to have lots of choices, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got the water, but if you're looking at the top of a roof before you're looking at the water, and a lot of those middle units, it's not all penthouse. I don't know that I'd want to spend that kind of money if such a large part of the view is going to be the top of my neighbor's roof. I mean, that may not be in the planning. That may not be a planning. Maybe it is a planning consideration. What would you say to that?
I would say, and once again, this is not to be dismissive, callous, or glib in my, but I don't know. I don't know what the appetite is.
I think
And
I don't know is a great answer.
and
So few people, everybody, yeah.
time will tell, whether there's an appetite as you get above that roof of, what the premium would be, and will it make sense in terms of the construction cost in order to maximize interstitial space in order to achieve those views, and can one pay for that, because you're building a layer which is not inhabited between floors, so I think ultimately is the question is, where do those two lines on the graph intersect in terms of does the view premium cancel out and exceed the cost of those zoning interpretations, for the
Because once you're at 165 feet, so there's 4 floors of parking in the retail. and then you're at 100, 165 feet. Let's say you're at floor 7.
Yes.
And then you've got, the rest are maybe 11 floors. As a consumer of real estate, if I'm looking at floors 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 5 floors before that roof actually recedes into the background, I think that's a real concern in terms of, is anyone going to buy this?
Yeah.
And it's, in my experience in a sales profession, that I've seen people ignore the obvious. People, they know what they're doing. No, not all. We're humans. We make mistakes.
Yeah.
Are those 5 to 6 floors where the roof is really an issue going to pay for themselves? Is it really going to be that desirable? I don't know, maybe it is, but for me, that would be a big turnoff, to be paying so much money to look at a roof. And I don't care what's beyond it, even if it's a pretty water view. I'm just gonna be looking at that roof and going, why did I do this? So yeah. And the thing is, as a condo owner, when you're paying maintenance fees, it's not divided by water view or value. It's square footage. So I'm paying the same maintenance as somebody up on top, and my view is, not that great. From a value perspective, I'm going elsewhere. I'm not paying this condo. In the beginning, the condo fees are relatively lower, but a savvy buyer at that level may look at the prospect long term and go, this doesn't add up for me.
The firm who's designing it, they happen to also have a company in their office, which is a pioneer of virtual reality and digital renderings and animation. And I think they've actually, just zooming out a little from this building a bit, they've been working on a citywide model with the hopes that development applicants could even use this tool that they've created in order to see how buildings are inserted into Sarasota, and also what actually we could answer some of these questions by strapping on virtual reality glass, seeing where those views become compelling and where they're not. Because like you said, at a certain point, we are looking at the backside of Bay Plaza, and then we're looking at the roof of it. And then at some point, the
view becomes pleasurable.
The view better, because the foreshortening of that foreground becomes much less prominent. Start to see the blue of the bay, and maybe even the barrier islands beyond that, Lido and Saint Armand's and Longboat. So that's one of those things which it likely can be answered best by the higher tech side, which is the virtual reality, and
I have to say, living on Golden Gate Point, I have seen renderings of interior development. Actually didn't happen. This one rendering that I'm thinking of, for buildings that were going to be about 4 stories high, not that tall, showing waterfront views in the interior. And I looked at them and went, this is not reality, right?
Yeah.
This is not. And so I think it's wise to have a healthy skepticism, because the temptation to gild the lily, putting it kindly, right, with your customer, to show the penthouse view as the view, let's say. And who regulates that? I don't know that anybody does.
I find it irksome, because I can usually tell when a rendering has been fudged, so it's like when I see these interior shots, and then I see, and once again, I'm not saying that they would engage in that, because they're very ethical people, but I'm saying that I have seen in the past, in other cities and such, where, and I saw this in Miami, like on almost every rendering, where the vanishing point of the horizon it was like, it felt like you were the building were leaning over, because the exterior, something that had been photoshopped behind the glass, of the. So basically, one of my questions is this: is for a digital model and rendering to be valuable, I prefer that it be based upon an actual digital model, physical model of the city, and its geography. And if that is your starting premise, then rely upon the veracity of that scene in making decisions.
But
For
if there is,
the consumer as well as
yes,
city staff, you know?
yes, yes, for everybody involved, we get an honest reckoning of regarding what is being proposed by the decision makers, by the buyer, by the designer who wants to, you know, dislodge an impasse, a design impasse, or something like that. So we're always looking for truth in rendering, and so if one can demonstrate ethical modeling of renderings, not engage in the Photoshop sort of thing where we sort of, oh, let me just tweak it here and make it look better and whatever. Like, we
Yeah.
have to really, with our post production after something is rendered, to
Mhm.
not engage in that sometimes, because, like you said, there is a temptation to put that, that water view beyond the glass when we know it's going to be a railing, or
Yeah,
something.
or the roof of your neighbor, really.
Yes.
When I look at this, and it's the reason why, the healthy reason why you have people on a planning board who are in real estate, who are in development, that optimally they're serving the public interest, and they are able to put their finger on these problems. They're able to look at this and go, listen, have you thought about the fact that most of your occupants are going to be looking at a roof? Have you built that into your business plan versus the competition? May be an issue in terms of selling. So anyway, we could go on and on. Andrew, is there anything, you live here, you're an expert. What would you recommend people who are concerned about this? What would you like them to consider about the Obsidian, their proposal that maybe they haven't?
Well, one thing we didn't hit on, which is a passion of mine, is the whole idea of slenderness.
Mhm.
And I am a fan, I'm a proponent of letting buildings be narrow. Now, I know there's limits to it, because I don't like the ones on 57th Avenue. We've discussed that in
In
Manhattan.
New
You
York, yeah.
know,
Mhm.
it begins to be absurd at a
Yeah.
certain scale. Even at our scale, I think there is something that is perhaps valuable about promoting or requiring slenderness. In other words, a maximum floor plate size above a certain floor.
Mhm.
And let's say a developer has a very wide site. One could do two narrow towers above a podium, rather than, very wide and very tall.
Yeah.
And there are many projects around town where we've seen that when a certain height is combined with the width, it becomes more offensive to a certain swath of the
Yeah.
public. The
Becomes
width,
too big and imposing.
it's bulk, and
Yeah.
bulk is, just like a person who's broad-shouldered and tall or whatever.
Yeah.
Bulk is this dimension plus this dimension, and that's when, views, breeze, sunlight can be smothered. Our zoning code doesn't address slenderness or daylight. It's very perverse, because there are some other zoning districts which are very short, like 2 or 3 stories, that have daylight plane in there as a regulating thing. Daylight
You
plane,
don't have a daylight plane?
we don't have it in the taller districts, really.
Okay.
So daylight plane is when you take an angle like this from a street or public space. In addition to their maximum height, they actually still have to fit within the envelope that's implied by that daylight plane.
So they can't be like a
Yeah,
tall, narrow.
or they can be below a certain floor. So, for instance, what was
Mhm.
common in the Art Deco era was, let's say I'm making a number here up, but let's say you went 6 stories up, and then it broke to a 45 or a
Right.
60-degree
Yeah, you
angle.
just can't go straight up all the way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's where we get the step back articulated skyscrapers of the 20s and the 30s in New York that are so gorgeous, and also,
Right.
right. And they allow, they allow the beam of light to sort of
Mhm.
filter the street, because the sun is not, the buildings are aware of the position of the sun due to that coding instrument, that zoning code
Mhm.
regulation. There's a whole rich series of things that we as a community could begin to look at, as we have now started to molt and get taller, that could at least retain some of those livability issues, that are most important to us.
Andrew Georgiadis, thank you so much for being my guest. And everybody, you have been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida. If
you, Kat.
drinking is no longer fun for you and separates you from other people, you can attend an AA meeting. They've been there. More information is available by phone at 941-951-6810 or online at aasrq.org. And thanks so much for listening. Be sure to stay tuned for more great public affairs programming here on WSLR.